It's a great, great pleasure to introduce Kenneth Anger. We waited a long time, tried to have him come last year, but he does live in London, which makes it a little more difficult than New York would be. He's here now doing a sort of a mini tour, I guess, 3 places, and we're fortunate enough to be one of them. By way of just brief background, I want to give you a few points that I picked up today at the press conference that I didn't know before, and that is that he sort of was spawned in Hollywood, as it were, with the big studios, and had quite a bit of experience there soaking up that flavor, which you might keep in mind when looking at his films. After I knew it, I tried to think back over them, and I'll look at them again tonight with that in my mind. Apparently a remarkable grandmother who loved it and took him there, and from there went on out and began making films at a very early age, and eventually wound up in England, where he is now in London. He's been there for the last 7 or 8 years, and is now back here for a tour for the first time in a number of years. Kenneth Anger.
Well, thank you for coming. It's my second time in Pittsburgh. Once I hitchhiked through when I was about 15. I'm going to show you tonight, I hope you're patient to sit through everything that I have been able to produce in the last 26 years that I can show on a screen. I've made other films, but other films are in fragmentary form or need prints, or else have rather sadly shrunken so they can't be printed until some new printer is invented, which is something that happens with film. It's a very vulnerable medium, and I've learned working at it over the years that it's kind of like personally surviving. I mean, I want sort of staying power with my images. I mean, I'm trying to protect them and save them. And it's never a matter with me with like taking up a new film and dropping the old. I mean, I've never withdrawn a film because I would say, well, gee, that's an adolescent work, I better sort of bury it. In other words, the ones that I've released, I for better or for worse, they're out there. I mean, anybody can see them if they can find how to get a hold of them. That's not too difficult. But I hope in a few, if I come back or some other time, or perhaps just you'll be able to see here without me being present, some of my earlier films, non-Hollywood films, but films which I made when I was pretty young, which I'm trying to get restored together. I finally decided, for a long time I wasn't really interested in that, but then I sort of become interested again in my beginnings in films, and I said, well, maybe I should start getting these little things. They're 3 and 4 minutes long, and already, like my very first film, which is called Who Has Been Rocking My Dreamboat, was inspired by a pop tune that came out at that time by the Ink Spots, which is called Someone's Rocking My Dreamboat, and it was the summer of '41, and the movie was about children in a playground sort of doing war games as the fog of Santa Monica comes over and they pretend it's poison gas from Japan and drop dead as the song ends. But the film is now in rather lamentable physical state, and I have to work on it to try to save it. I don't know if I can save it or not, but the impetus was that someone gave me a new LP of the Ink Spots that have now been reissued, and I heard Someone's Rocking My Dreamboat again for the first time in a long time. And I said, well, gee, I've got my soundtrack. Maybe I better start getting the picture together. I'm going to start the program tonight with a film that isn't mentioned in the program notes because it isn't a film by me. And it's a film about me that was made against my will, oddly enough, but which, by submitting to it, in other words, proving I was a cooperative person in certain public ways, allowed me to go on to make my latest film, which is called Lucifer Rising, that I've been working on for 3 years. And I was proposed a deal by German television, and I don't even particularly care for television. I don't know if anyone here works in the medium, but I don't own a television set among the great list of things I don't own. I mean, I don't own a car, I don't own a television set, I don't own a camera, and so forth and so on. If I need any of these things, I'll hire them for a weekend or for however long I need them, but I don't like possessions beyond books and a few clothes, things like that. So we're going to see this German television film. Now, they said they were going to make a portrait of Kenneth Anger, and that this was their deal, that I'd give them a 40-minute television film on me, and in exchange they would be half producer of my new film. And I needed even a half producer, so I agreed. And this crew of krauts, excuse the expression, followed me around for 3 months in England, trying to find out how I made films. And it wasn't exactly a pleasing relationship. Often I got up in the morning before they got up to do some shooting on my own that I wanted to do, and then I pretended that I wasn't working that day, things like that. I mean, but they got their little film, and it includes excerpts of some of my films that you'll see complete later. And what I did was I cut off the German commentary, threw it away, and cut out all the interview scenes with the interviewer that I didn't like at all. We couldn't get along. I mean, he'd ask me sort of pedantic German questions, in English, of course, but I mean the sort of profound things that I don't like asked in that sort of question. At any rate, so they've been all thrown out. So the film is quite a bit shorter now, and it doesn't even resemble what it did. But I've used the fragments of it as sort of introduction to my work. And then from then on, after this film is over, I'm not going to talk again. You're going to see the cycle of my films, as I call the films dating from Fireworks 47 to Lucifer Rising, which is a work I'm working on this year still. And I will have a break just before showing Lucifer Rising to introduce it, because the reason I'm making this tour of these 3 American cities, like Pittsburgh, Buffalo, and Chicago, is, well, I've been invited very kindly, but also I have to find a way to finish my new film because I've gone over budget, and so I'm sort of hustling, as they say, and I haven't quite figured out how I'm going to do it, but I at least want to also test the response to it. So we'll get on with the first film, and I'll be making a few comments as it proceeds. What? This is at work in my Hampstead, London flat, which I no longer have. But it's all taking place in sort of a shoebox. I mean, it's a small room. It's the only room I had, and I had to sort of build a set in that room. And that said in German, film conceived as a magic ritual, which is more or less accurate, but it sounds a bit too heavy in German somehow. This is a young steel worker that I found in Middlesbrough, County Durham, England, which is in the far north. It's what Blake called the dark satanic mills, like you used to have here last century. I guess they've been cleaned up, but I chose him to play Lucifer, even though he was a non-actor, with all the sort of risks that entails, though I didn't require him to be an actor. But in my films, I typecast from the look of people. I mean, Eisenstein did the same, and Podovkin did the same, but they had the Soviet state behind them. And when Eisenstein walked down the street in Moscow and tapped someone on the shoulder and said he'd like him to play a sailor in Potemkin, he had the power of the Soviet state behind him, so maybe it was a bit difficult for the bloke to refuse. But in the people I use in my films, aside from a few, I guess you could call them professionals. I mean, I have, in my latest film, used Marianne Faithfull, who's a professional actress, and a professional drug addict who's now cured, of course. But the biggest challenge for me is to, what I guess you could call the Pygmalion complex, to find someone who never conceived or thought of themselves as an actor and actress and turn them into something on the screen. Oh, I'm shooting through a kitchen sieve there, which is usually used for other things, but I thought that it might be interesting. And that's the effect I got. I had to work on it farther, but I wanted a scintillating effect, because I'm not interested in just the look of things. I'm interested in things as they might look, could look, should look sometimes, according to my imagination. And of course, it's much easier for me to work with objects. These are very passive actors and actresses, these two candlesticks that belong to Aleister Crowley. In other words, I can make them do this and change the lights on them, and they never complain that they've got to meet their girlfriend or that they've got a heavy date, so they have to cut out shooting and disappear. And I started working in puppets before I went into movies. I had my own puppet theater, which entertained a few of the neighborhood kids. But even though people are far from puppets, they're the bigger challenge. Now this is from Invocation of My Demon Brother. And this was my last American film. And the reason I left America was because it was part of a much longer film, and the rest of it was stolen by a juvenile delinquent who later became a senior delinquent and is now in San Quentin for life. That's an example of typecasting that's a bit too true. This is him, Bobby Beausoleil, who later became well known in the headlines about Charles Manson. That's Lenore Candell, who's a rather well-known poet in San Francisco. I do like to use artists in my film whenever I can. This is a great artist. It's Samson de Breer, who's the son of the King of Romania, who lives in a pleasure dome in Hollywood, which is a tiny bungalow in the shadow of what used to be called the RKO Studios. It's now called Daisy Lou, much less interesting than RKO, where King Kong came out. And these are sort of my ideal cast, because each of these people, Renata, Curtis, Paul, and Samson, are in their own way artists. Renata's a painter, Curtis was an experimental filmmaker, Paul is a painter, and Samson is a poet and a diary keeper. And I had much less trouble and indeed delight working with these people as a communal effort on this film. It's the largest cast of any film I've ever done, the Pleasure Dome, than any film I've done before or since. But it was just a combination of circumstances of a little group of people that got along together and found it amusing to meet for a series of weekends. that went on for maybe 2 months to do a little shooting that was almost like playing games, dressing up and playing games. But the difference between that film and this made almost 10 years later in San Francisco, Demon Brother, is that the games became more real. Like you see, there's Charles Manson in my house in California. I just knew him as Chuck at that time. And this is, again, one of my American period films, Scorpio Rising, with Bruce Byron, who is a real Scorpio, and he's now a taxi driver, and he's put on quite a little weight around the middle since he did this part in the film, which is one of those things that can happen to people, not only Marlon Brando. And in these films, you see, this is to me a hallucinatory reality, but it's also real. It's his room. I didn't make a decor. This is the way he made his decor. I mean, he lived with about 10 cats in this room. That was his own sort of temple to himself, with the television set going day and night, a noose hanging from the ceiling, and pirate flags. It was the kiddies, very much, I'm afraid the film's broken, but it was very much like a sort of kiddies club room. This is Cameron, who is the only true witch woman I've ever worked with. I mean, she's a genuine witch, acknowledged by the right and the left. And she's a very talented painter, lives in California. And the only woman I've ever lived with for any considerable period of time. And she was a delight to work with, too. And that's Samson de Breuer in one of his many disguises as the Great Beast. One of the disguises of Aleister Crowley. This is the face of Aleister Crowley, who was the English poet who is my present inspiration. Aleister Crowley died in 1947, age 42, and he was the first really emancipated modern man. And he's called among his people that have studied him Proteus because of the number of different faces he could take on. He was English, but he claimed that his name came from Caraule, which is Old Celtish. And this is Dr. Kinsey, who is a dear friend of mine, who came to visit the work I did in Sicily, uncovering the paintings of Crowley. He covered an entire house with symbolic paintings on every surface. And when he was kicked out by Mussolini in 1923, they were all covered with whitewash. This is Crowley about 25 when he was a mountain climber. He's a curious man, Libra. This is 2 years later when he went from mountain climbing to sphere climbing and became a magician, but not the rabbit that pulls the hat kind. This is 30, when he published some of his most important philosophical works. This is 50. Some people call it his Churchillian period. But you see, he was a man of many faces, and this is his Swami period, when he was a Brahava guru. And he wrote during this period, when he became like a guru, he wrote a marvelous book on yoga called Yoga for Yahoos. And now all these books are being republished. At one time, you couldn't find a Crowley book for love or money unless you're extremely lucky, but now, like a lot of things, they're now being reprinted and for better or for worse are available. That doesn't mean that just because there's more copies that more people are going to understand them, but at least they're available. They aren't unattainable. They can be found, if not in Pittsburgh, at least in New York, This is, again, one of my American films, Scorpio Rising. That was I made completely alone, photographed alone. This is a television print, so the color quality has changed considerably. This is one of the films that was nearly destroyed due to a lab, and I'm now working restoring it. And I've got here tonight my own first print of the new color, which the film has been completely recut. I had to take every splice apart, put it all together again, splice by splice to save it. And unfortunately, it will stop from time to time because I have some tape splices in it that projectors don't like too much. This was a non-staged event. In other words, this was a Halloween party. Of course, the cut-ins are from a cornball biblical film. But the Halloween party really happened among a little group of motorcyclists in Brooklyn. And I just increased the light by adding a few spots and things like that. But I photographed what actually happened. But I mean, if I'd wanted it to happen, it couldn't have happened any better than the way it did for my purposes. The amount of it I was able to film. But I was only able to do that by working completely alone. I mean, I had to go in there, a group I didn't know. I met them at Coney Island, riding around on their bikes, and I sort of admired some of their paint jobs, and they allowed me to take a few pictures, and then it worked up. And this, again, is working with real people, not actors. I mean, these are really sailors. When I was 17, I was either fool enough or bold enough to approach them directly and say, would you like to be in movies for one weekend? And Fireworks was made in 72 hours straight without any sleep. And the sailors learned their parts. I mean, all these movements are choreographed. Where they're walking, swinging the chains and so forth was rehearsed before they did it, and the way they advanced. And they were absolutely marvelous in doing it, and they enjoyed it. They took it. There wasn't one of them that sort of cracked jokes or thought, well, you know, this is too silly. Let's go out and do something that's more interesting. But of course, the secret was I got it all over with in one weekend. And that's why a filmmaker has to, if he wants to capture a fugitive phenomenon, he has to work fast sometimes. Other things require great patience, I think. And so I suppose the ideal thing is to have a combination of both, the ability to capture something almost instantly and the ability to have great patience. And some people make the mistake of thinking that Fireworks is an autobiographical film, but it's not, because the character here who is smoking is not me. I mean, I played the role at age 17, but I've always been a non-smoker. And it may seem like a joke, but I mean, the fact that I played a character smoking a cigarette when I'm a non-smoker made for me the whole character a character and not me myself. And so while it has undoubtedly elements of my dream life or fantasy life in it, it's still another person outside of me. I never identified with the character. Now, when I first started making films, coming from a Hollywood tradition of being a child actor, but I quit Hollywood at 4 years old, so after Midsummer Night's Dream of Max Reinhardt, I began conceiving movies in the Hollywood way of drawing pictures of every single scene. Now, these are from Puss Women, an unrealized film about Hollywood in the 20s. It had an all-women cast of vamps and Clara Bow types, Barbara Lamar types. And my grandmother's marvelous trunkfuls of 20s clothes were the wardrobe. And these are my drawings. And I did, like a storyboard with a drawing of every single shot. That's the way I used to conceive of films. But what I didn't find was the money to bring each drawing to life. And the only piece of it I got shot was a few minutes of the wardrobe scene. You just saw the wardrobe opened in the drawings, and now this is the star who's sorting through her dresses, trying to find one for that evening's premiere at Grauman's Chinese Theater. I mean, all this is just suggested. I never make the narrative in my films explicit because I leave that to sort of television situation comedies and your big, long movies that you pay to go see. And each, of course, for me, these dresses mean more than just patterns of cloth because each one belonged to a star. This was Barbara Lamar's sequin sheath that appeared in one of her films before she died of heroin, one of the early Hollywood tragic victims of drugs in the 20s. And this is Yvonne Marquis, who's one of my women discoveries. I mean, I thought she was a great-looking girl. And so does Jonas Mekas. He agrees with me. He likes this film because of her, I think. And she later went on to become the mistress of the President of Mexico. Which is a career of sorts. I suppose it's being an actress in a different way. I mean, this is deliberate, like impressionism in a film. It's not just bad focus or amateurism on my part. I deliberately wanted, like, recreating a past time, the 20s. This was before the vogue of the 20s, before Singin' in the Rain and the whole sort of nostalgia industry, of course, that we have now, which is almost making me not like the 20s anymore. I mean, so I haven't gone to see No No Nanette. But I wasn't interested in the jazz baby aspect of the 20s. I was interested in the yearning for the unattainable aspect, which the whole thing represented. Now this is a lost film that was rediscovered, Rabbit's Moon, which is made in Paris under the name of La Lune des Lapins. And in this too, it's a quest for the unattainable in the form of the moon. Of course, this was before Armstrong set foot on it by 20 years or so. I made it in 1950, and it was lost until 1970 when it turned up again in one of the basement storerooms at the Cinémathèque Française in Paris, so I recut it. I mean, cut it for the first time, because I'd never cut it before. It was just uncut footage, and so it's now one of my films. So my advice to filmmakers is, even if you don't like some footage you've taken, if you've got an attic or some place to store things, it's better to store things and save old film than throw it away, because you may look at it with new eyes years later and find that it's of interest. Because this film, Rabbit's Moon, is using memes from Paris's leading school of memes, but the actual movements were all choreographed by me, and I made the set, which is all made out of paper trees, and a paper moon, like the Nat King Cole song. You'll be seeing the complete film later on. And of course, the little children that you see coming out here are now grown up and married. And it's one of the sort of eerie qualities of film that you can capture sort of the shadow image of someone. They aren't really alive, but in fact, Stan Brackage's children said when he saw this film, they had a wonderful comment when they saw it for the first time. They said, "Oh, look at the ghosts." To the children, I mean, the littlest of Stan Brackage's kids, these were ghosts, including the rabbit. So, and the rabbit is this I don't use like conscious symbolism, but the rabbit was sort of Easter. That's what it meant for me in the film, which is about this time of year. This is me shooting in England, near Stonehenge, a great Celtic, holy pagan center, pre-Christian. And I'm shooting, I'm defying English law by shooting this scene because they denied, the Department of Parks and Monuments denied permission that I shoot scenes of these ancient standing stones, which are like Stonehenge, that old, but with a different meaning than Stonehenge. They have a male-female meaning. And they denied permission for me to shoot around them with an actor in costume. They said if I wanted to make a documentary on the stones alone, I could, but I couldn't use them in any fantastic way. I think they might have thought I might be doing a cigarette commercial. Now you see, this boy, he was 19 when he did this, very difficult to work with. And he's an Aries, and an Aries, you know, the animal that symbolizes an Aries is a ram. And he's surrounded by sheep and rams. And he really looks like a ram. I mean, he has not only that curly hair like one, but he has an Etruscan profile like a ram. In other words, that's why I chose him, because he's a pure astrological type in the 18th century sense of Lavater's physiognomy of like animals into humans, the animal humans. Like you have some people that are like foxes, some people like birds, other people like bulls, and so forth. And I find it convenient as an artist to use this. Now I'm working here with an Ariflex that I could only afford because German TV was paying for it. In other words, I usually don't work with quite such a complex camera. It was a great delight to work with one. And I even had an assistant to load it for me, which I don't mind. I don't find that impure at all. Now this is the greatest moment that has ever occurred in any of my filmmaking in 26 years, when we were doing a scene to invoke a storm, and a storm blew up of fantastic intensity over Stonehenge and Avebury, the sacred ancient site. And of course the fellow that was doing the movements was not me as the wizard, but is this young Aries who is ruled by Mars, as Aries is, and is a fire sign, so he almost got hit by lightning. But as it was, the torrential rain was sweeping across the Salisbury plain. And we just got one take of the shot, and we had to run back to the car to protect that expensive hired camera. But, you know, those are the moments that make, this particular moment is worth 26 years of trying for me. And somebody else can say, well, just a coincidence. Okay, we're going to go on and into my films now. I'm taking the unfinished first quarter of my new film to 3 cities to try to raise some sponsorship from you rich Americans. I don't mean you rich Americans present here in this auditorium, but in the abstract. In other words, I'm an incurable optimist. I'm going to just mention a couple of things, and one is that these films, I wasn't born with a gold spoon in my mouth or anything like that. In other words, these films were all difficult for me to make, but not as difficult as if I'd been born on the sidewalk in Calcutta. In other words, I was born into a middle-class background like most of you, And instead of wanting a car of my own when I was a young teenager, like most of you probably did if you're typically American in that way, I asked for a camera, and my grandmother got me a wind-up 16 frame per second 100-foot load Kodak, which served me for my first 4 films. And I really rather missed that camera. I don't know what happened to it. I mean, I should sort of have it like on a shelf, like my first camera. But it got lost, or maybe someone stole it, I don't know. Or maybe I threw it away, I have no idea. But you can still buy them, I think, in probably pawn shops. I mean, they have one lens, probably quite a slow lens, like 3.5. They hold 100 feet of 16 millimeter film, and you wind them up, and a shot lasts as long as the spring lasts if you want a long shot. You can't make a longer shot. So it limits you to a certain kind of cutting. So in my very early films, I started on a very fast tempo. In other words, I hadn't seen Kuleshov, I hadn't seen Eisenstein or any of those great masters. I haven't even seen Griffith and his extremely fast cuts, like in Orphans of the Storm, The Chase, or going over Niagara Falls, or trying to tie in the French Revolution with the fall of Babylon and so forth. I mean, I hadn't seen these yet. That came a few years later. But the film I'm making now, I'm pushing, you see, when I first started making films, there was no such thing as underground films. Underground meant, I don't know what it meant then. It certainly didn't mean anything to do with art when I was a teenager and started making films. However, very few people recognized the people like myself, only I was sort of the youngest member at that time, making independent films on 16 millimeter. And they in rather grandiose, hoity-toity terms, in order to fit these freaks into a cubbyhole, which culture vultures always adore doing, they labeled us the avant-garde. In other words, they couldn't think up any decent Anglo-Saxon or American term for us. They had to drag in this old, tired, worn-out French term from the 20s that had gone down the drain and had been considered like effete indulgence, the avant-garde of the 20s. And I don't know how many of you know your film history, have been able to see the films, and some of them are very strong and others are rather weak and self-indulgent, and the same goes for the things being done today independently. Some are strong, some are weak. It's hard to say. I mean, each one of you maybe has your opinion, what you like, what you don't, but 25 years from now, 50, if the films survive, maybe opinions will be radically reversed, because this can happen in any art form. So I've always wanted to make a feature. In 26 years, I've never been able to get enough bread together to do a full-length film, even on 8 millimeter, though I've never worked on 8. I've started on 16, and I've stuck with that. And I've made one film on 35 millimeter, which was La Lune de Lapin, or Rabbit's Moon. And that was because the French Cinematheque managed to convince someone at UNESCO, when UNESCO was in its very first year in Paris, that they should support this young American expatriate artist. And the actual film that I shot Rabbit's Moon on was 35 millimeter Russian negative. And all the lettering on the can was in Russian. And we had to correspond with Moscow. This was, remember, 1950, the Iron Curtain and all that, to find out. There was no indication what ASA rating, whether it was a fast film, a slow film, but it was a negative film. I mean, it was 35 millimeter, and the idea of making a film on 35 was so tremendous that we did finally tests. That was the only thing we could do. We did exposure tests, and figured out that it was a fairly average, about like plus X or something. I mean, sort of a semi-slow film like Hollywood had in 1932. This was their standard black and white film at that time. But there was only about 4 tins of it, 4 tins of 35 millimeter. And they promised me some more, but they couldn't be sure. So I filmed each shot only once. It was carefully rehearsed, and we rehearsed the thing like a dance, and right straight through the whole plot, including the third movement you haven't seen because it was never filmed, of Rabbit's Moon. And I began filming it in sequence, and got as far as the end of the third movement, when the producer, who had lent me gratis a very small studio, which about as big as this stage area, I mean the seat area here, where Rabbit's Moon was filmed, which was really a dubbing studio in Paris. It was used for like dubbing retakes, or when you had to do an insert, like someone looks at their wristwatch. Well, they used this studio for sort of wristwatch shots and that sort of thing, or else close-ups when they had to put a close-up in after the film was finished. It was sort of a miniature retake valley. And I was kicked out of the studio. And this was my beginning of disillusionment with human beings, because up to then everything seemed to be coming up roses, and this man had promised me the studio for the whole summer. A studio, it was just a glamorized garage, you know. But it was a studio. It had a catwalk up above. It had some very ancient lights in it that made horrible hissing noises and looked terribly dangerous. And I had to have a gaffer for those. It cost me quite a bit just in the technical crew to keep all this professional 35 equipment going. But it wasn't finished. And it was to have been a longer film. Practically every film you've seen, except Fireworks, Inauguration, I mean, I had planned something a bit longer, a bit more elaborate, but money ran out, circumstances intervened. In one case, a star got killed and so forth. I mean, fate stepped in, and I wasn't able, so what you've got is what there. I mean, I made as best as I could from what I had left. Somebody else would have just shelved it. But I, being an incurable optimist, I thought after going through an initial period of depression, something could be done with this damn footage, because after all, it was all I had. So now I'm determined to make a feature-length film. My next film is going to be 93 minutes long exactly. And if it's time different, that means somebody's cut out a scene or it's broken or something. I mean, I planned every second of it in my head. I don't write scripts anymore. I don't draw drawings anymore. I just keep it all in my head. And this is Lucifer Rising, that I've been working forward for years and years and years in my fantasy imagination towards making. And I've had some fairly lucky breaks. I mean, in the end of Invocation of My Demon Brother, which was made partly in San Francisco during the Flower Power period, the very end of it, the summer of what they called the death of the hippie, when they had a symbolical funeral of the counterculture and all that. And then the subsequent spring in London, it was made partly there. I mean, the reason I left San Francisco was that the so-called love generation, too many of them that I had contact with personally, I won't slanderize a whole group of people, but the ones seemed to be anyone I sort of befriended, and some waif I took under my shelter just so they wouldn't be sleeping in the cold fog of San Francisco or something. I mean, my embassy that I lived in, the old Russian embassy, I began calling it Rip-Off Valley because little things started to disappear. A lens, some electrical gadget that I couldn't do without, and so forth. And finally a camera went, and so forth. So this sort of disgusted me. I said, well, nation of shoplifters, goodbye. So I packed up and went to live in Europe again, which is sort of my alternate planet, I suppose you can call it. Not that they don't have plenty of shoplifters there, but I hadn't had a personal experience with that yet. that came later. So Invocation was the beginning of Lucifer Rising. It was supposed to be, the fellow I found, Bobby Beausoleil, was supposed to have been the first Lucifer, and indeed he's a little Lucifer there. But this is the first time, I mean, was playing a destructive character, and I always typecast, that he actually destroyed himself. Now, he's a scorpion, and a scorpion is supposed to sting themselves if they're surrounded by fire or in danger of death. They commit suicide. Now, this is an alchemical legend. I don't know if it's biology. But nevertheless, Bobby literally stung himself, because when I fired him, after I had proof of his dishonesty in his dealings with me, in other words, he took bread that was supposed to be used for one purpose and used it for something quite different, that placed me in great personal jeopardy, I fired him. And as Truman Capote in the last issue of Rolling Stone said that Bobby Beausoleil was my boyfriend, that's completely untrue. Bobby Beausoleil was under contract to me. In other words, we wrote a letter to each other that he'd work for a certain amount of time for me and get paid so much bread a week. And he had his girlfriends and slept in the studio with my sets and costumes, and I had a room in the back. But in revenge, because scorpions are very vengeful, typical scorpion in politics is Goebbels. He waited till hiding in the park, in the bushes of the park on Fulton Avenue in San Francisco, waiting till I went out one night for dinner, came back in, kicked the door in with his great big boots, splintered the 19th century woodwork in the embassy. That was really gorgeous stuff. It's really too bad, you know. Kicked his way into my studio and ripped off what he thought was all the footage of himself. In other words, any can marked Bobby, 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 he stole. And so he thought this was his revenge, you know. I fired him, okay, nothing of him would exist on film. So, however, I am not the most methodical filmmaker, and I'd mislabeled a few cans. And a few cans that were marked Lenore or Susie had Bobby in them. So he got a few Susies and Lenores, the takes of these particular girls, thinking it was himself. And so in other words, just out of a coincidence, he didn't quite succeed. And the only images I have of him are the ones which he didn't steal, which are incorporated in that little film, Invocation. And I was pretty depressed for about a year after this incident, but then Mick Jagger gave a pop concert, a free concert in Hyde Park, and he told me to come along and film him, and that sort of got me charged up. And then he said he'd do a little score for me on the Moog synthesizer he just got. So Mick, in one night, I mean, I played the film for him, and then he sat down in his little studio in the garden, in a little tiny sort of gnome's hut in the back of the garden of his Chelsea house, and with his new toy, a Moog synthesizer that he'd had for about a week. He didn't really know how to run it. He did this track you heard here. And so I lost Bobby, and Bobby's now in San Quentin for life, and I don't intend to go visit him. But I gained a soundtrack and a few other things. I mean, that's sort of the way things balance out. Because I think the soundtrack that Mick did for me is people that are in his business partners have told me it's the only thing he's ever given to anyone for nothing, because he didn't charge me. I mean, because as you know, when he tries to give something for nothing like Altamont, like a free concert, or even the one for the earthquake victims, that was Bianca's insistence, incidentally. But he doesn't think in those terms, like. So I guess I can give a little thanks for that, because I admire him as an artist in spite of a lot of bullshit. So in the new one, I'm working with another pop musician that you won't hear, but hopefully some of you may want to come back and in October, when I hope to come back to Pittsburgh and bring the finished Lucifer Rising, because it's almost done. In other words, the things that have to remain to be done cost a lot of money, but they're all ready to do in London. And the musician I found, who is much more amenable to work with than Mick, and available, because Mick is too busy with his own scene, is Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin. And he used to be the guitarist of Yardbirds, and now he's lead guitarist and really organizer of Led Zeppelin. And he's doing a 9-instrument track for Lucifer Rising using recreations of like ancient Egyptian instruments and what we call Atlantean instruments. I mean, even older than Egypt. So this is the track which will go on the film you're now going to see. Now, could we have the slides? To introduce Lucifer Rising, I'm going to show you what inspired it. These are slides designed by the English poet and magician, tarot cards, designed by Aleister Crowley, who was born in 1875 and died in 1947, the year I made Fireworks. I never met him, but I have read all his works and read his private diaries, and I admire him very, very much. And he spent 40 years designing the symbolism of these tarot cards, which express his own, in other words, they express every possible human emotion through the tarot pack of both the major arcana and the minor arcana. And these are designed like this Empress in tones of pastel contrasts with the orange of oppression, which you will find a great deal of in the first movement of Lucifer Rising. And cruelty, the particularly dark orange of cruelty, which Crowley, in an astral vision, saw as being the red of Mars, you will find contrasting with the pale blues and aquamarines of the delicacy and love of the priestess. And virtue also is a strong color, but this is the colors of the sun. This is sun and Aries in its purest form, this gold, this yellow. You'll find that. And that movement of gold and yellow goes through my film, I mean, naturally in movement, like it sweeps through in that card. And this combines all the, like the universe combines both the cruelty and the kindness and the sweetness and the sorrow, I mean, in terms of symbolical color, all in one card. Here again you have like Parsifal, I mean the noble knight, the hero in terms in color. Now in debauch you get into like chartreuse, corrupt green, the green of gangrene and fungus. And here again you have masculinity in terms of russet and amber. Here you have the Martian thing, not cruel but strong. In other words, the Martian colors, the orange and the gold. Here you have the jade, which is like purity and valor. I mean, the sword carved of jade. And here you have death, which is colors used very consciously in Scorpio Rising, the film you've just seen. These belong to the new film, Lucifer Rising. This again is the new these color schemes are in the new film, the gold and blue. Here again is a more delicate version of the gold and blue, which is a feminine color symbolism. I mean the lotus, the water, the heron. And here we descend into earth colors. I mean, disc is materialism, it's money on the most debased and vulgar plane, but it's the talismans of power. And love is the delicate rose of the first light of dawn, which is the color, the actual color of Lucifer, if you could abstract Lucifer into one single color, because he's called the son of morning, and that's M-O-R-N-I-N-G. The magician goes into amethyst, which suggests the age of Aquarius, because amethyst is the stone of the new age that we've just entered. Failure, this is what is called the blues, and I think it's too obvious for comment. This is the Hierophant, which is another name for the high priest or the man who knows. This is the Queen of Discs, who again is an earth goddess. You see her with the palm trees and the oasis, and I use this in my desert sequences, these colors. This is another earth princess, Princess of Discs. This is autumn, the glories of autumn. And wealth is tending towards the green of corruption, but it is held in balance by the purple background. Power is the female and male elements balanced. In other words, the blues and the oranges balanced. In perfect harmony, that's called the city of God. Ace of Cups is the female glorified in excelsis. In other words, this is the female symbol of carried to its ultimate. Success is also the picture of the face of God for some. Happiness is what we can have down here if we're lucky, sometimes. I mean, and this is again sort of Easter colors, Easter egg colors, delicate amethyst and Easter lily color with with stems full of sap. Worry is the beginning of jarring colors. The prudence, paradoxically, is also, according to Crowley, a negative phenomenon. So these are jarring colors. In other words, he believed in taking risks. Luxury is about as high as you can go and remain stable. In other words, the cups are not overflowing. Things are in balance. Abundance is already like America in the late technological decadent culture that you're going through as you move towards the 21st century. In other words, the tendency is that you have a few too many things you don't really need. You know, the extra TV set, the extra camera you don't really need. Now here we're moving back in contrast into peasant virtues. This is earth. This is no electricity. This is animal power, earth, digging your garden with your hands and making things grow. And this is what makes everything grow, the sun, which is my personal God. But that's just my choice as an artist. Ace of Wands is like the core of the sun. In other words, the phallic essence of the atomic marvel that is our own sun. And now we'll move into the first part of Lucifer Rising. The first 15 minutes is what I call a fine cut. It's a work print. It has its tape splices, but the tempos are as I wish it in the final film. Now, it's a slow movement, and so be a little patient because it doesn't have the drones and the music and the stereo, which the final film will have. And the second part, after a red spacing, is what I call a rough assembly of the rest. And this, at any rate, is a film I'm determined to finish. The Sphinx, of course, is Lucifer himself, because he's the god of morning. His real name is Harake, and he faces the rising sun, and he has for 5,000 years. And this sequence was filmed in northern Germany. It posed quite a political problem to be able to film there at what was the Celtic center of sun worship. It's the secret Celtic center of sun worship where standing stones hidden in the Black Forest were used for thousands of years by your ancestors, at least some of you, in worshipping the sun, which was a much rarer deity in the north of Germany than in the Nile Valley. And therefore, the Germans felt a need for human sacrifice where the Egyptians didn't. Now, Marianne nearly killed herself on these steps because she swore to me that she wasn't on drugs when I took her to Germany, because I wouldn't have taken her if she was, but I've had a sad, I've learned by sad experience that truth and junkies don't go together. And she was on heroin. And she stumbled and fell after I'd warned her to watch her step. Of course, the demon in her had to then defy me. And she fell down these very steep stone steps and bounced once very hard, and I caught her. And she went into a state of shock, foamed at the mouth, and her knees had the skin torn off. And she was unconscious for 2 hours, but when she came out of it, she insisted on going back in the afternoon and finishing the shot. And that's what I call a good trooper. And the effort that was taken for Marianne to go up this 75-foot rock was sort of the equivalent of a Mount Everest expedition for some healthy young men, because she's a very, very sick girl here. But as I say, I typecast, and she was exactly right for Lilith. And I might add that Miss Marianne Faithfull has publicly announced that she's renounced heroin, and she's taken a cure, and she's once more a healthy girl. And I might add, in love. This is again the opposite image of feminine symbolism, with Isis yielding. In other words, the lotus blossom opening. And this is the actual ceremony invoking the demon Lucifer, the demon of light, or the atomic demon of energy, which is manifested as light. And it's according to an old, it's not a ritual according to Crowley, but it's a medieval system I used of this flashing colors in the circle. And of course, in a film, the ceremony is paraphrased, and I might say slightly censored, because I don't show you everything. Because part of it would be boring, and part of it would be perhaps offensive, and it wouldn't serve my purpose to offend an audience at this stage in the film when this occurs. And also, this particular circle ceremony goes on all night, which would be one of those very long films. And the idea of the circle is I don't know if any of you have practiced meditation, or even if any of you have ever been in a bad temper tantrum, but the idea of the circle is of course, you're physically going around, you're getting slightly dizzy, like the dervishes do, or like the kiddies do on a merry-go-round. But at the same time, you are creating a force field, at least according to the magicians. And you have an area that is negative ions on the inside and positive outside, and you banish the elements you don't want. And people say, well, it's ridiculous, it's just a painted line, like a line across the street. But of course, artists and a few madmen and saints and a few other people have the privilege to read more into such things. And these are Aleister Crowley's candlesticks as they appear in the final film. Now this image took me 6 months to create, and this is as if a night had passed with the temple filled with incense and the forces beginning to manifest outside the circle that are actually hostile. In other words, if these forces, which are being irritated and stirred up, could get to the wizard, they would blast him, knock him flat. This is a reference to the Celtic cult of the severed head that our Anglo-Saxon ancestors had all over Europe. Of course, these are private references, just like this reference to the ancient phallic giant in England. The phallus was covered over in Victorian times. It's enormous. It's about 75 feet high on the hillside. And it's, again, an image of Lucifer. It's Thor, or the lightning god, or Lucifer. They're all the same. And here is the invocation of the storm, of the lightning, as it actually occurred at Avebury, 30 miles from Stonehenge. And Avebury was the actual cathedral of pagan Celtic culture. In other words, ancient England, preceding the various invasions by Danes and so forth. That one nearly killed me. This is my most recent footage from Iceland, which accommodated me by blowing its top around the first of the year. You probably heard about it or read about it. It's a small island off Iceland, which after thousands of years, the extinct volcano suddenly became active. These are colored engravings by the great English master of the early 19th century, John Martin, who was called by his detractors Mad Martin. And this is his imaginary Egypt in the conflict between the Jews and the Egyptians, which is one of the themes of Lucifer Rising, even though, of course, I didn't write that in my thesis when I applied for the visa to go to Egypt, because they might not have thought too well of it. But again, these are private things. They're not exactly private jokes, but I mean, the conflict of mythologies, the conflict of cultures, of races, and so forth is very much part of the Luciferian conflict. I mean, the dynamism that emerges from conflict and what can be called hate, though hate to a magician is so close to love, they're practically indistinguishable. This is the fall of Babylon, according to John Martin. And I use these works by a painter in my film to contrast natural, real elements of lightning, storm, and the destruction of values or civilizations. And all this is on the area of a metaphor of the birth of a new age of Aquarius. This is John Martin's very famous in Victorian times, but forgotten later, etching of Balthazar's feast, the handwriting on the wall, and that glare of light on the left is where the letters appeared. And Griffith was familiar with that etching and used it as the basis of the set, the very famous, enormous set of Babylon, Balthazar's court in Intolerance. That's the source. This is the fall of Nineveh. And of course, politically, I'm a Spenglerian. And like Spengler, I believe that cultures flourish, go through a classical period, and go through a decadence, and then die like plants. In other words, they're organic. And my metaphor or allegory in showing the end of these glorious and magnificent and powerful cultures, such as Nineveh and Babylon and Egypt, is to remind modern people that perhaps if they get the subliminal message that we too are part of that pattern. I've been working in England with English technicians, and this next, what you call special effect, took me 6 months to get right. In other words, I was working on this one sequence of shots that you'll see in the colonnade here for 6 months, where it's called a vertical wipe. But it was the first time anyone in England had ever done it on 16 millimeter, and then they said it was impossible. some of the shots are still in black and white because my first work print was black and white. This is Osiris and his servants, who are the Abashti figures who are put in the tomb, and he's the same color as they are. This is again Donald Campbell, the director of performance, who plays Osiris. And this is Marianne Faithfull, just after she had tried to commit suicide in my apartment by cutting her wrists. And I didn't have a movie camera, but I had a still camera, and I snapped a few shots of her. So the transparencies are in the film. And that's the scarf I gave her to tie up her wrists. I'm hoping to spend an extra day in Pittsburgh to film some slag being poured in very close-up to use in this sequence of incandescence. Because Lucifer, being a light god, even though the Christians called him a devil, his original name was the son of the morning, and he's the god of light. This is the face of Lucifer as seen through the Aztecs. In other words, they're a god of fire, because every pagan culture had one, because fire, or the sun, was identified with life. I've always been attracted to Dante's Inferno and the kind of Dantean visions of apocalypse and so forth. And I never thought I could achieve it like as a special effect in a studio or as a miniature, but finally all it cost me was a return airfare to Iceland, which isn't all that far from England. Now, this is my recreation of an actual event that I was honored to take place in the Temple of Luxor at Carnegie. Now, this isn't real photography. It's a recreation of something I saw and experienced. I'm sorry the film breaks a little bit, but it is a work print. These shots will, of course, be in color in the final film. Well, thank you very much for your patience, And I was hoping we could have at least a very short question and answer period, but I see that we've gone well past midnight, and I imagine there's regulations in the building about closing. Isn't that right, Sally? I think perhaps well, could we have 5 minutes while the projectionist rewinds? Okay. Well, I've always had, see, this is my private print, and my own private print is a color print, because Fireworks is one of three, what I call three nocturnes. And even though it is filmed on black and white, like Ode d'Artifice is filmed on black and white, and Rabbit's Moon is filmed on black and white, my idea is to use the blue tint to tie the three together, and then I may, at some future date, put them together with the title Three Nocturnes and have them as a little film that can be had separately. But sometimes, I mean, I continually sort of rework my past films. I don't actually I haven't yet gone into a heavy recutting or a Henry Jamesian revision of an early work like he was continually doing to the end of his life. And some critics said that he ruined his work, but at least the early works were published, so if you preferred a simpler, more direct version, you could always find an earlier edition. But at least it kept the old man occupied during his latter years. And times he wasn't busy being a social butterfly. But I've actually, again, I've been playing with it. I play around. I may have another more black and white prints. If I can afford it, I'll have more color prints, but the color prints cost twice as much. And the thing I'm faced with, I mean, my rentals come from, my income comes from hiring these out. Already the rental is fairly steep. I mean, and my rentals have dipped according to the dipping or the lowering of the level of funds available for cultural institutions such as this. I've noticed that the so-called recession has hit me. I mean, living in London, still, most of my income comes from America, from the films I hire out, because the so-called college film circuit is much better organized in America than it is, and it's much larger, of course, with much larger audiences than it is in England or happens to be anywhere in Europe. But I may decide, I mean, I'm testing it with the blue. I may decide a lighter blue. I have a choice of about 6 different blue filters, and I've just had this made a week before I came here. I thought I'd bring it, because it frankly is the only print I have available for the moment. But it is my own print, and I don't intend to sort of release it yet, except to you. Any other questions? No, that's Mickey Rooney playing Puck, which ties in with my non-existent imaginary fantasy film production company, which is called Puck Film Productions. And also the fact that I knew Mickey when he was older than me. He was already like 14 when I was 4, which is a huge difference to children, but he was very kind and sweet to me. And of course, to me, Scorpio has a puckish humor all the way through, but that's the way I see it and the way I made it. And at the moment it occurs with the cut-ins of the comic strips and so forth. That's what it means. I mean, it's a humorous reference, and I didn't pay Warner Brothers anything for it. I just stole it. What? Sorry? Well, look at it again sometime. He has little horns on his head and he has fur on his legs, and it is Mickey Rooney. And one of the moments when, about halfway through the film, when just about when he finishes saying, "Oh, what fools these mortals be." I didn't hear you? Oh, yeah. And you can tell he's laughing even if you can't hear it. You know that. He had a way of cackling that was marvelous. He was a marvelous actor. He still is. Yeah. Well, do you want to know the truth? I mean, because I'll tell you the truth. I don't usually tell it because I sort of usually evade the question or hope it won't be asked. I didn't wait around to find out. I made the film, I shook hands with everybody, and I said, "Thanks a lot, fellas," and I split for Los Angeles, where I cut it, and then moved to San Francisco. And I heard that one of them got quite paranoid and thought I owed him a lot of money, and so forth. And but then that eventually died out. I mean, he used to go and sort of stand in front. Actually, I felt a little sorry for him, but if I started paying one, because I explained I didn't have any money, and I gave him expenses. I mean, you know, I fed them, I bought them if they needed some part for their motorcycle, I bought them that. I treated them nice, you know, as well as I could. I don't think I was exploiting them. But, you know, when they come around afterwards and say, "Well, I'm now a movie star and you owe me $10,000, well, I just can't do it, and so I have to sort of do a little fancy footwork. And but the kids, most of the Italian kids in it, the one that got freaked out was an ex-Marine that was a psycho case. He got an honorable discharge, but he, you know, even so, he was seriously sick Marine when he was a Marine, because you can be in the military. Sometimes you can be quite sick and it doesn't show. But any rate, he was the one that sort of became a bit upset. And then, but I never received any threats or anything like that. I never received any letters, because they could have mailed them to my distributor or left them at the theater. And the kids in Brooklyn all came and brought their girlfriends and thought it was a giggle. They enjoyed it, they laughed and liked it and were apparently proud of it. All the ones that lived in Brooklyn. But the one that lived alone with the cats on 3rd Avenue, he had the idea that he directed the film. It was his idea, and so forth and so on. In other words, he was a typical sort of unintellectual, undeveloped Scorpio. I mean, as I see it, because that's what he was, and that's the way he acted. And any other questions? How much I want to finish it? Well, I need about $12,000 more. Huh? I've spent 20,000 pounds of English sterling, and huh? 20,000 pounds. 1 pound equals what? 2.8. The dollar, incidentally, is slipping. I mean, it isn't, according to European currency, even the pound, it isn't what it used to be. You know, it's sort of dwindling. I don't know. I never asked. You see, I'm very naive about money. If I started thinking, "Oh dear, that's dollars and that's that much and this and that," I would probably freak out and say. But you see, things like my expedition to Egypt cost a lot of money. It was very simple. I just had myself, 2 cameramen in case one dropped dead. And again, I did the composition and everything, but I get too nervous. Well, high-strung or fidgety or whatever, irritable. I'm very bad at loading a camera under a situation of pressure, unless it's completely automatic, you know, and there isn't such a thing. In other words, I'm apt to do something wrong and not get the loop exactly right, and it's apt to jam or something. I can't risk it, so I rather leave it to a cool head to take care of that part of it and to unload it, to mark that this is real 15 of taken on such a date, and to write it in a logbook and so forth, you know, so that we end up do all that sort of thing. I mean, I could afford that for the first time, to have helpers of that sort. But traveling, you see, I've gone on this trip on the film, I've gone to India, which you haven't seen any of tonight, the Indian footage. I've gone to Egypt, which you did see. Germany, of which you saw a little bit, but a difficult part of Germany. In other words, a part that is politically right on the border, where they don't want anybody. And, you know, an American with cameras there sort of stirs up sort of all kinds of third man paranoia. And it was really, I mean, it was rather difficult and rather expensive to do a fairly simple trip to Germany. And then there's Iceland. And I haven't hired any limousines on the production, but the money is gone. You know, the money is gone before the picture's finished. I mean, nearly gone. I mean, it doesn't mean that I can't sort of get back to London or something. But I've had it happen before. And you see, if there's been a galloping inflation during the 3 years I've been making it, lab costs gone up 20%. 20%, not 3, not 12, but 20. And a new tax called VAT, value-added tax, has come on in England, which adds another, you know, like 5% or something. I mean, the governments keep doing these things to people, and there's nothing they can do unless they're going to destroy the government. You know, and then they'd probably invent their own taxes. But, you know, so because I take such a long time to make a film, there's that factor, like in many other projects, like the space, getting into outer space or getting to the moon. I mean, you say, well, it's going to cost so much, and it ends up costing 10 times more, 100 times more, because of the length of time it takes. And but I think I'll get through it somehow, because if you know, I may be resorted to some of my old methods of cutting corners, but well, it's not a lot, but it's as much as I got from the Ford Foundation, and I've never got any money from any foundation again like that. I got $10,000 10 years ago, once. You know, they just did a one-shot deal on 12 filmmakers, and I was one of them. But, and that helped, like, pay off the lab debts on Scorpio, and make a little tiny piece of KKK. And I don't think, they didn't, you know, ask to see the finished film or anything, but it's about, if it were a TV commercial spot, KKK, my little custom car film, $10,000 would be a ridiculously small budget. Because, you know, the enormous budgets they spend for those tiny little TV spots that you get thrown in your eyes if you watch television all the time in America. You know? I mean, they fly for a little bottle of beer or a little Coca-Cola or a cigarette. I guess they don't do cigarettes anymore, but they'll fly 50 people to Jamaica and spend 2 weeks on a beach for something that lasts 30 seconds or maybe 10 seconds, you know. But, well, I mean, the money went because I paid off my lab debts on Scorpio. See, the money was given to me to help my filmmaking, and to help my filmmaking I had to pay some debts off first. I felt, though perhaps I shouldn't have. I should have perhaps fudged a little bit on the morality of it. A little too what? Well, you can read the script. I think Film Culture is going to publish it sometime. I mean, there is a synopsis for it. I usually don't write synopses or treatments for my film, but for that one I had a complete written treatment. Yeah. It's longer. It was intended to be long. I filmed quite a lot more, and it's sitting in cans, and I could maybe get out 4 more little segments as long as this one, which is 4 minutes. But then there's disjointed scenes, things missing. There's a drag race sequence. There's a sequence in the Mojave Desert. There's a painting sequence that is the thing that I liked most, really, which is incredible abstract things with spray guns and colored lacquers, backlit. Because it gets more into like to science fiction, away from the sordid quality of Scorpio, and then again, the boys that make custom cars are not like the rebel outcasts that ride motorcycles, the outcast motorcyclists. They're sort of clean-cut American kids.